Good morning, everyone, or perhaps good evening or dawn, as in the case of some of our panelists. Welcome to the third webinar in the series on research participation. I am Paola Barbarino, I'm the CEO of ADI, Alzheimer's Disease International, and sitting next to me is Craig Ritchie, the co-chair of this panel today. And I'm shortly to pass the word to Craig, who is going to run our panel questions and answers. But before I do that, just a note to let you know that this webinar is live, that we are welcoming questions online from all of you, so please do participate. They will also do some live polling, and that we will be showing also a video during the course of this webinar, which we have not done before. I would also like to extend a great thank you to Roche, who has enabled us to run this panel, which is live. You can hear ambulances going probably past this wonderful studio. And so thank you to Roche for enabling us to do this series, which has been complex and difficult to put together. Thank you to all of our sponsors at ADI that enable us to exist in the first instance, and to the wonderful members of ADI who are following us and taking part in this debate. A thank also to our medical and scientific advisory panel, which is chaired by Serge Gauthier and Dr. Alireza Athri, and also has a very big executive committee. And the panel has been recently completely refurbished, a lot of new additions, many more women, much more participation from lower and middle income countries, many more young researchers. So you may want to go and have a look at who is new in the ADI family of researchers. Finally, my thanks as ever go to Wendy Widener, who has been the main inspiration behind this particular panel and getting all of you together. Chris Lynch, Annie Bliss, and Jennifer Gowan, who you can this live webinar go very well together. And now I'll stop here and I'll introduce Craig Ritchie.
So thank you very much, Paola. It's a delight to chair this, co-chair this third ADI webinar. My name is Craig Ritchie. I'm Professor of Psychiatry of Aging at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also privileged to lead the EPAD project, European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia project. What I'd like to do now is just maybe go around all of our panelists and just say a quick introduction.
Very good. Yeah, my name is Martin Traber. I'm a medical doctor, very pleased to join this panel today. I serve as a global medical lead at Roche, and I'm specialized in pharmaceutical medicine, so drug development sciences, and absolutely passionate about how we potentially can change the life of people living with neurological diseases, including Alzheimer's disease, which is today's topic for us. So very pleased to join the panel. Thank you.
My name is Howard Gordon. I was diagnosed with dementia in March 2017. I'm a board member of Dementia Alliance International, a steering group member of the Three Nations Dementia Working Group, and many other organisations, and I take part in research.
Thank you very much. Okay, Philipp, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Philipp von Rosenstiel. I'm as well, like Martin, a medical doctor working in the pharmaceutical industry. I am part of the late-stage clinical development group for Alzheimer's disease and dementia at Biogen, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am involved in the aducanumab development program, which recently made news. And I'm also really, for the last 17 years, have been passionate about developing drugs for the treatment of neurological diseases with high medical need, and really Alzheimer's disease is, of course, first and foremost on our mind as an intractable medical problem which we have to address. So I'm very pleased to be part of this panel and to discuss clinical research in Alzheimer's disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philipp. So can we maybe go to Pippa? Yeah.
Hello, yes, hi. I'm Pippa Kelly, and I am a journalist and a dementia blogger. I'm an author. I must say that my writing on dementia tends to be more on the social care side, so I feel in very, very exalted company. But I do understand how the media works, and I know how to sell a story in, and I think I might have one or two tips on that side of it.
Thanks, Pippa. And maybe Martin next.
Thank you. My name is Martin Traber. I serve as as a global medical lead at Roche, by training, specialized in pharmaceutical medicine and passionate about drug development, and also the changes we see we can bring about for people living with serious neurological diseases, specifically also Alzheimer's. And very pleased again to be part of the discussion, and really keen also to see what the questions are from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, last but not least, Eliezer.
Hi, I'm Eliezer Masliah. I'm a director of the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging in the US, which is part of the NIH, or National Institute on Health. And we're primarily focused on research on brain aging and Alzheimer's disease. We're the largest funding agency for Alzheimer's disease in the US and probably the world, with about $2.3 billion a year. We conduct research from very basic to clinical trials. At the moment, we're sponsoring about 140 clinical trials in the US, going all the way from preclinical development to phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials mostly early stage Alzheimer's disease or preclinical Alzheimer's disease. And again, I'm very excited to be here and look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we've gone through the panel in terms of doing introductions, and for those who've done this before, you know that we like to know who's on the call, who are the participants. So we've got a series of polls that we do through the course of the next hour or so. And the first one is really for us to get to know you. So you should see on your screen a question. We're interested in learning more about you. Can you tell us who you are? If you could just click as that goes forward, and we'll get a sense of who you are. So, as the votes come in, let's see, we've got a lot of, probably about a quarter of the people are from the pharmaceutical industry, another quarter, maybe almost a third, employees or volunteers with an Alzheimer's or dementia organization. And those are really sort of forming the majority of our attendees today. So really interesting, I guess, maybe given the topic that we've been promoting this time round, to see so many folk from the pharmaceutical industry. So that's fantastic. Thank you. And what we'd also thought we would do today is, because of the nature of the topic, which maybe in some ways is a little bit more detailed and granular than previous topics we've had about pharmaceutical trials, clinical trials, we recognize maybe we should share some knowledge about what actually is involved in clinical trials. And we're delighted that Eliezer was able to share with us a video that was produced by the NIA. And we'd like to just show that now, if that's okay. So Wendy, can you put the video on?
In healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells, or neurons, in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves two proteins called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. the vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris, and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet, and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
So I think we'll agree that was a fantastic video and really set the scene perfectly. What I'd like to do before I go to the panel with some of the questions that we've been receiving or have received over the last few days, I'll maybe go to Pippa first with one of the questions around communication, is we have another poll I'd like to maybe sort of set the scene with, and that is up on the screen now. And it's how hopeful or optimistic do you feel about the future of clinical trials, specifically maybe dementia research, to make a difference generally? Very optimistic, somewhat optimistic, in the middle, pessimistic, or very pessimistic. So why don't you vote now? We'll see how, well, the mood in the room is like. So just reading this, it looks like about 3/4 are optimistic. So we've got 19% very optimistic, 50% somewhat optimistic, 12% in sitting on the fence, if you like, and about, I can read that, 20% who are a little bit more pessimistic about the future. So Pippa, can I come to you? This was a question that we discussed online before this, but what role do you think the media could or should have in helping achieve dementia prevention?
I think the media has got an incredibly powerful role. It's crucial, really, for you. And the media must be used to give people hope. I think that came out of a previous seminar. And I think because of the history that there has been in clinical trials, it's really important that you keep pushing forward. And even when there are knockbacks, need to look for the positives. And there are positives, even when there are knockbacks. So, for example, and I am very aware that I'm coming from this from my social care perspective, so apologies huge in advance if I'm making mistakes. But I believe through my research that Lilly, Roche, Biogen, that's recently been in the news, have all stated that they remain completely committed to dementia research, even after their leading candidates, drug candidates, failed at stage 3. So that's a great positive. Even despite the setbacks, they're still carrying on. And also, I think it needs to be stressed in the media, this is, you know, your role to push forward this message, that research and trials, even if they don't succeed in their own terms, are not wasted because they inform research, as with cancer research, which has been going for decades longer than dementia. One of my sort of unusually pessimistic blogs I did was to compare cancer and dementia in the round, really, because so many people said to me, dementia is where cancer was about 20 or 30 years ago. When I researched it, I realized that was not true at all. Dementia is where cancer was about 70 years ago. And I think, you know, this is a process and it's ongoing. And also pharma companies have a really, really difficult, tricky balancing act. You know, I'm very aware of that. They've got to make sure that they manage expectations, keep it real in a very risky scientific field, while generating enough interest to maintain funding and patient participation. And at the moment in the media, you've got the two extremes, really. You've got the tabloids like the Express and the Mail, who have sensational stories about wonder drugs. And then at the other end, in the more responsible papers, like the FT, you might have headlines on the failure of drugs because of the financial impact of that and the share prices. So what I think you can do to use the media is, and this is where I can come in as a journalist, you need really strong human stories. That's what you need. And a brilliant example was Tom Whipple, science editor of the Times, did a piece in the Times on the 27th of April, and he turned what was a negative story into a really positive piece. And it's well worth taking a look at that. 42-year-old woman, Sophie Leggett, takes a DNA test to see if she's got this familial mutant gene, and she has. Terrible tragedy. But there's a line in the story that says her tragedy, Sophie's, that she knows she will almost certainly develop dementia in her 40s, is a boon for science, because that's a focus now, to look at where these drugs that weren't working previously might work on people that are pre-symptom. And so Sophie is, in that sense, she's a godsend. And she has signed up to a clinical trial. And this is her legacy. She's got a daughter, so it's all expressed in these wonderful personal terms. She's doing this so her daughter might have a greater chance, because she's got a 50% chance of getting the gene, the mutant gene herself. Things will be better for her daughter. So I think that message of things will be better for the next generation, for our children, is really important. Then in that very personal story that anybody, even somebody as sort of stupid as me when it comes to science, can understand, are dropped these really good facts. Just drop them in.
So I think on that point, and the other panelists on the call will be involved in some of those familial studies. We might come back to that later. Some of them sponsored by the NIH. But Howard, I just want to. We all read the media. We all read it from a different perspective, as an academic, as a human, as a clinician, whatever it might be. But as somebody with living with dementia, can you read these stories in the media? How do you react to them? What's your perspective?
For me, one of the main issues is this cure narrative. You get these headlines that they've had a cure for Alzheimer's or a cure for vascular dementia, and when you actually read it, the research is just starting phase 2, it's just finishing phase 2. In the last 100 years, there's only been 4 treatments that have actually gone past phase 3 and gone to market. Yeah. And you're raising people's expectations, and then when you read the article, you're knocking them back down again. It goes across social media. People think, "Oh, great, they've got a cure. I'll be happy. Yeah, I'll be good. I'll be all right for the future." Yeah. And then when you actually find out the facts, and I know pharmaceutical companies need to promote their research, and researchers need to promote their research, but they have a responsibility to the people they research for to not unduly raise expectations.
So I don't know, Philipp, maybe, and then Martin. That balancing act, which I think Pippa alluded to, between being I won't say responsible, but communicating your science on the one hand, and also creating hope on the other, which I think is critically important, as Pippa alluded to. Philipp, how do you from a Biogen perspective, how do you see that balancing act?
Yeah, I think thank you for very relevant questions. Yeah. And there's quite an echo on the line, by the way.
We should mute everybody else if they're not already muted. That usually kills the echo. Mute me. There we go.
So but again, it's certainly important to not unduly raise expectations, and we clearly do this with first and foremost with the investigators, with the staff at sites that participate in clinical trials, to be very clear about the pros and cons, the benefits and risks of any investigational treatment when they discuss these compounds and the trials with potential participants in the clinical trials, so that informed consent can be given to whether individuals want to participate in such trials. Now, of course, there is a limit to what we can, how we can influence media to not unduly raise expectations, and as Pippa said, in less responsible media, there may be a hype around individual treatments, I think, or potential treatments rather. I think, and maybe Martin can chime in later, but certainly in the scientific community and at congresses, we're very careful to present what data we have that might give us hope that a potential treatment might have a beneficial effect. But we're very, very careful there to provide a balanced view of the benefits, the risks, also the risks of a failing treatment effect or lack of treatment effect, and the risks of building too much hope on, for example, small phase 1b, phase 2 trials. So I think it's through the scientific communication as well as through the mediation by the investigator when speaking with potential participants that we have the biggest impact on succeeding in this balancing effort.
Thanks very much, Philipp. And I think Martin, Philipp mentioned your view on this, but I'd also like to maybe pick you up on where you, from within Roche, you see the medium to long term. I mean, how close are we, do you think, to actually, this is a question we're always going to get asked, how close are we, do you think, to developing that disease-modifying therapy that will get past phase 3 into the market that Howard was talking about?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Craig. First, I want to say I'm really pleased to see the panel being optimistic, and also see again the panel of opinions that again the participants of this call show now. And obviously I am notoriously optimist now, because we look at the glass half full in the sense of we try to find the learnings and to see how can we move forward with everything happening in the space. And certainly want to echo Philipp's comments in terms of it's really important that we follow the science and want to be transparent and want to make sure that people understand the risks, fully understand the risk involved, but also the potential benefits. And that obviously comes with a responsibility for everybody involved in clinical trials and the drug development process as such. Going back to your question about how close are we, I would say we are closer than ever, because the learnings continue now. And I think our understanding, we've seen it also in the video about what's happening in the brain, specifically for Alzheimer's disease, is bigger than ever before. So also the aspects around diagnostic procedures to understand, do we have the right participants in these clinical trials, that really increased significantly. And I think it's also really worthwhile recognizing that some of these developments, including understanding that amyloid beta is involved and the tau, and to make sure we include only those people potentially already living with Alzheimer's disease who show this pathology. This is a fairly recent development, and it's only now that we see then these aspects in the recent years in terms of how are then the results of these efforts. So I would say we get closer and closer, but there's still a long way to go. And we should also not forget that over the recent news of some of the anti-amyloid drugs, crenezumab from Roche and also aducanumab, as mentioned by Philipp from Biogen, there are other molecules who still continue. For Roche, it's gantenerumab in a phase 3 clinical trial, and also Eisai has its compound moving forward. So it's really important to balance that. And obviously, some of these news may be then received outside as being or heard so loud, that they influence, and then many people have then questions around, is it the right thing to still participate now? And there is a clear yes. So we need to move forward also with the existing trials.
And I think that's a really good segue really to Eliezer, because you obviously, from your perspective at NIE, you mentioned about funding, sponsorship, hundreds of trials. I mean, what from your perspective are the main reasons, if you like, to remain optimistic and looking across a broader portfolio of activity in this area?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think that, as often happened, we tend to focus on the negative, but there has been, as it was said by Martin and Philipp, tremendous progress in the last few years. What we have learned about biomarkers, what we have learned about genetics, pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease is absolutely spectacular. I think that we understand much better now the complexity of the disease. We understand that it is not only the accumulation of amyloid or tau, but that there are also, as we saw in the video, a number of other factors, including inflammation, vascular, and so on. So what we have tried to do in terms of sponsoring a portfolio on clinical development on Alzheimer's disease is try to hit as many targets as possible, what we call in the field shots on goal. We really want to have more shots on goal. And just to give you an example, we have a very robust number of clinical trials targeting the vasculature, specifically hypertension. We know that individuals with sustained severe hypertension for a long period of time are at greater risk for development of dementia, and in particular Alzheimer's disease. And recently we sponsored a very large clinical trial with other NIH institutes called Sprint Mind that had as an objective to determine how lowering aggressively blood pressure in individuals with Alzheimer's in very early stage with mild cognitive impairment or in later stage with dementia, how would change blood pressure might impact the disease. And remarkably, it was found that actually in individuals with the earlier stage with mild cognitive dementia, aggressive treatment of hypertension had or delay the development toward dementia. Unfortunately, the trials show that once dementia established, it's very difficult to change that course. But at least we know that the earlier we intervene, the more is the potential for have effective results. So at the moment, we're sponsoring a number of other clinical trials testing different antihypertensive drugs, either alone or in combination with other non-pharmacological approaches like exercise, changes in nutrition, increasing blood sugar, blood metabolism, etc. Now, of course, we also moving into clinical trials where we're trying these drugs in individuals at earlier stages of the disease, in particular in asymptomatic stages of the disease. And here in particular, the example that Pippa was mentioning in persons with genetics mutations associated with Alzheimer's disease. That's very, very important. We have two trials, one going on in Colombia, actually in collaboration with Roche, testing one of their drugs, and another one worldwide with our network called Diane. And again, here the idea is to identify with biomarkers individuals at very early stages of the disease, pre-symptomatic, and then treating them for a long period of time, up to 5 years, with these different compounds that our colleagues at Biogen, Roche, and other companies are developing. So really very exciting opportunities here, but none of these would not be possible without the participation of so many volunteers in clinical trials. I mean, that's why to us it's very important to communicate that there is hope. Everybody's working very hard in industry, in academia, in the government, and we want people to participate.
think on that point, I'm going to come to Howard in a minute about participation in clinical trials and what it's like from a participant's perspective. But there was another question we received earlier before the meeting saying, are there other types of research people can take part in? And I thought I might field that one. And it bases my answer on what you were saying, Eliezer. I mean, we are talking here about interventional studies. We're talking here about drug trials. You talked about lowering blood pressure. You talked about maybe some exercise trials, etc. But I think the other side of that equation, what we've all been alluding to, is understanding the disease in more detail. The more we can understand about the disease, the more likely we are to find the right targets, to find the right processes whereby a risk factor, be it genetic or otherwise, affects the disease either to initiate it or to accelerate it. So there's a sort of beautiful balance between these observational cohort studies, which many of us are involved with, which develop that knowledge, that science, that understanding, where you then put into that the interventions to see if you can affect some of those processes. So what other type of research can you get involved with? You can get involved with cohort studies, and there's huge cohort studies going on all over the world at the moment, just trying to understand this disease, particularly in that early phase you alluded to, Eliezer, that early phase before symptoms develop. So cohort studies and clinical trials, two sides very much of the same coin. So Howard, what does it feel like to be in a research study?
It was great. I mean, it was properly explained. I had a plain English summary of what the research was about, what it meant to take part. Everything was explained to me. I had contact numbers to 24 hours a day if I had any problems. The research nurses were very good. The consultant was very good. I had regular appointments, and I knew I could contact them at any time. And I finished one last week, which was taking, well, I don't know whether I was taking the sartan or the placebo, but I did that for a year, and that was fine. There's a sort of a fear of taking part in clinical trials because of the Frankenstein impressions that people get, but it's not like that. You know, it's properly the pharmaceutical companies, the hospitals, the research centres, wherever you go, properly regulate and have your best interests at heart and your welfare at heart.
And perhaps we should add, for those of you that are listening to this particular webinar but did not listen to the previous one, the also complex issue of how to find out about a particular trial in your country and how to be able to take part if you're not living in Australia or in the UK or in the US where there are more trials undoubtedly. Do see the webinar number 2 because we tackle that issue and how people can find out and participate and how important indeed it is to participate if you're part of a population that does not normally take part into clinical trials, because dementia is a complex illness and the answer may come from sides that we haven't explored yet. Sorry, Craig.
Yeah, perfect. And I think that there's some fantastic questions, by the way, coming through as we speak here on the webinar. I want to come to one of those in a minute, but just picking up on what Howard was saying there. I mean, Philipp, from a sponsor's perspective, from a pharmaceutical company's perspective, you know, setting up these global trials, how can we keep people interested in being part of research, given some of the challenges we've faced historically with the results of some of these? So how can we keep people interested in being part of research in terms of both recruitment, but also, I guess, retention?
Yeah, I think the operative word here is hope, and without some degree of optimism, and I see messages coming through on the chat here. Without some degree of optimism, of course, it's hard to undergo the effort of being part of a clinical trial, which we appreciate is always a burden on participants. It's a burden on sites, and again, without some belief that this may be at least some incremental benefit and may either help the participant him or herself, or may help future generations of people living with Alzheimer's disease. So without that, it simply doesn't doesn't work. I think an important observation we make in our trials is that indeed participants often are in it with a high degree of idealism. And even if they are cautious about hoping for their own benefit, that there is, as Pippa described earlier from the subject participating in the trial, in a prevention trial, is that indeed there is a hope to do it for the greater good, for the present and future population of people living with Alzheimer's disease. So I think there is an ongoing belief that that we can make a change. Again, small steps possibly, but that there is hope to move forward.
So Martin, maybe come to you next. Maybe picking up what Philipp was saying there about hope, about idealism, maybe altruism, about why people participate in clinical research. And we talked earlier, and Pippa alluded to this in her opening, about the way we communicate the results of clinical trials back to the community, the participants, the investigators. Is this something, I mean, I know this is something which is always a bit of a challenge. What are your reflections on how we do it and how we could maybe look to do this well in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So communication is absolutely key. All channels are relevant. And I think before we can communicate results, it's obviously about how we communicate, as mentioned before, about potential participation in trials, and also expanding on what Philipp mentioned. What we do also learned and know today is what happens at the site, the clinical trial participating site, is absolutely critical. So that's the most important. So it's these conversations that people living with Alzheimer's and then investigators, site staff, study nurses, research nurses have with the people and their families, their carers. That's decisive. Yeah, that's decisive about again the level of understanding, the participation, the retention. Also, you asked earlier, and we want to take every effort possible, and there the aspect also of co-creating that. We can come back to that later if you like, is absolutely important. So we need to provide the right information, in the right language, the right amount of information also. There might be a temptation to be too detailed-oriented, too scientific. It's important that this gets across in words and in language that are understandable. And there also that the communication channels remain open, so that questions can be asked. How would you mention again 24 hours call centers, etc. But this intimate dialogue and this relationship at the site is absolutely critical.
And Howard's sitting beside me here nodding, and I think we did talk before about participation in actually co-design in a lot of the elements of research. Do you want to talk, because you're very much involved in a few programs on that. Do you want to maybe share that with us?
So in Sheffield, we have a research advisory group. So anybody applying for funding for research in Sheffield comes to us. They provide a plain English written summary, and then they do a plain English presentation, and that has to be done as part of the PPI section on the funding application, because in the past, researchers have written no, not appropriate when they're doing dementia research. But in Sheffield, you cannot get money without coming to us now to do your presentation. Yeah. And then we give feedback on, whether we think the research is appropriate, if there's anything we'd like to see added. I did one last year about hearing loss and dementia. And I said, well, what about hyperacusis? Because people with dementia don't just have hearing loss, they have issues with noise. Yeah. And that's now being taken forward in that research, and he's going to be having people with dementia on the steering group, which is another thing, having people, not seeing people with dementia as participants in research, but seeing them as partners in research, and being there from, not necessarily from day one, but once you've decided you're going to research X, Y, or Z, get people with dementia and somebody that cares for someone with dementia as part of your steering group to develop, run, and produce the reports for the dementia. And if you've got those people there on your steering group, they're the people that will advise you how to communicate to the participants in a way they'll understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that communication can happen at the front end of a project where people are being approached to consent and engage. But equally, it could well happen at the end of the project when the results are there, to how they are best communicated back through the media or through directly to the participants. Is that something you think?
That's part of being a partner in the research. And too often, I mean, I've done 15, 20 research projects in the last year, and quite often you don't hear any more.
Yeah,
exactly. It finishes and you don't get the feedback. Yeah. Unless you Google it later on, you don't get any feedback, and it's sort of
disappointing.
It's disappointing, yeah. And if people got that feedback at the end of the research, they'd be more inclined to go on and do other research because they felt part of the research.
So thanks. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. There's some fantastic questions that have actually come through. So some of those questions we were asking, we were able to share with our panelists before the meeting. But there's one really good question, and I'll keep it anonymous. I'm not sure if people want to be noted for who've asked the question. But it's a really good question, actually. But from maybe Eliezer, you could pick this one up. We talk a lot about cure. What would cure for Alzheimer's actually look like?
Wow.
It's a good question.
That's a good question. You know, we in the US as well as in the UK and a number of other European countries and in Asia, we have a national plan to address Alzheimer's disease. We have a blueprint, a roadmap as to what would this be, how do we want to achieve these. And the number one goal of the plan is to either prevent or find a cure for Alzheimer's disease by the year 2025. 2025, I mean, it's not that far away. But one thing that I think it's interesting to point out is what would that mean, right? And I think that there are different answers depending how the trial is designed, what are the endpoints, and how do we think about the disease, which right now, believe it or not, we're undergoing a heavy discussion as to what exactly defines the disease. Is the disease defined by the clinical symptoms or by the pathology that is going on in the brain? I think on the classical clinical trials of disease, a cure would be for the dementia component to disappear. But we know that many of the, as we call them, the disease targeting trials right now, going after amyloid or tau or other targets. I mean, what they have as outcome is to show that, for example, that amyloid in the brain is disappearing, or that the tau in the brain that accumulates is disappearing. So how do we define a cure? By those markers changing, or by the dementia going away? I think ultimately in people suffering with the disease, preventing those clinical changes or somehow reverting the impairment in cognition would be a desirable outcome.
So I think there's, picking up again a little bit of what you were saying there. I mean, I think there is a huge amount of work in patient-related outcome measures, and another piece of this jigsaw puzzle about what does cure look like. But we've all been mentioning a lot through the course of this webinar, and dare say previously, the word prevention. And I want to come to maybe Martin and Philipp, and cognizant of the time, so we really have to keep our answers a bit shorter. But we often get questions that says, why is all the focus on prevention? What about treatments for people with dementia? For symptoms, for people with moderate, even severe dementia? What's going on in the field regarding better therapies for people with dementia? So I don't know, Philipp, maybe first, and then to Martin.
Yeah, I think it's.
You have to disclose your pipeline here, by the way.
Yeah, I think prior research, we learn from every trial, whether negative or positive, and prior research would suggest that the likelihood of seeing benefit and seeing treatment effects are higher, at least for disease-modifying therapies, in those patients who are in the very early stages of disease or are even asymptomatic. That being said, I cannot agree more that there is a need for development of drugs in patients with more advanced disease, and those might be symptomatic drugs where there really hasn't been a lot of progress over the last years. So I would agree that this is patients with moderate or severe Alzheimer's disease or dementia for that matter is absolutely necessary. I think there are, of course, different challenges posed by this patient population, because usually at that time, Alzheimer's disease pathology is not the only pathology that we encounter in the brain at that time. And these start to be mixed dementias with other causes of cognitive decline.
Thanks, Phil. So Martin, and then there's a question I want to almost close the panel discussion with Pippa, because we've only got about 10 minutes left. But Martin, that question about symptomatic treatments, if you like, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I also want to echo Philipp's comments. No, I mean, clearly we learned going earlier is better, and but we shouldn't forget about, again, the later stages. And we feel a little bit now, while caring for more potential earlier treatments and interventions in the preclinical so-called asymptomatic setting, other people living with dementia progress meanwhile, no? So, and that population grows massively. So there's this sense of urgency that we have. We shouldn't also forget that, again, there are the symptomatic treatments, no, that you mentioned, and those do an okay job, yeah? So it's what we have currently, and many benefit from them over many years, yeah, can stabilize. Others don't benefit, yeah? So there's an unmet need, and we need to push forward, need to pursue that. And we hope really also that we will learn in the preclinical, in the familiar form, where genetically it's, I would say, stronger defined or more clearly defined the disease. We will learn really a lot in the next few years only.
Thanks so much, Martin. And we've got about 10 minutes left. And what I want to do is, finish off some questions here. There've been a lot of questions coming through we simply have had time for. And I know from previously, the ADI folk are very good at getting back to all of these questions, after the webinar's completed. But before we go to a poll again, I wanted to bring in Pippa. There's a really good question here that suggests, and I'm just going to read it out as it stands. Journalists in the popular, for those who are not on the video, air bunnies, journalists in the popular press are lazy or not sufficiently skilled to write an interesting, informative article. Pippa, do you want to open up a school for journalism?
I went to a school for journalism. So interestingly, you'll find that within the journalistic world, some of the people that we have the highest respect for are the Sun headline writers, because actually it's a very, very difficult job. It doesn't matter whether or not you like what they do, but it can be very, very difficult. But okay, if that's what you think, then what you need to do is you need to feed those journalists. And this was going to be kind of like my takeaway, really, so maybe I should say it now. What journalists thrive on, and this is where clinicians, everybody in that, so your sector, if you have a really good case, and as a person, you'll know what that is. If it's the case like Tom Whipple came across, he will have looked at so many cases to get that really good case. A journalist cannot have enough really good, strong case histories with personal stories. So I think you can help there. And I know that there's the patient confidentiality issue, but I also know that participants in these drug trials, and Howard will perhaps agree or not, they often tell me that they find a lot of purpose from it. So I think it was Martin who said it can be a burden on participants. But even within that Tom Whipple piece, Sophie was saying when the trial comes to an end in 2020, she knows that she'll feel a sense of grief because something's coming to an end. So, participants, they get a lot of purpose from it. And really my message is that be on the lookout for really good case studies, because that's what a journalist wants. Then you can educate the journalist with the science behind it. But what they want is the human interest story, because it's no good if it's not going to sell the papers. And people want to read about human stories.
So thank you, Pippa. And I know there are schools for journalism. I meant the School for Journalism and Dementia. That's what I meant. I hope I haven't upset you there. So what we're going to do is I want to rerun the poll again. to see whether or not we've had any impact on our level of optimism. And then while we're doing that, I want the panel to think, because before we have some closing comments from Paola, I want everyone to come back really quickly. If there was one thing in the future we could do differently from what we've done in the past to help get a treatment to market, what would that one thing be? Okay, so let's run the poll again about how optimistic we are about the future. See if this panel's made us all more optimistic or slightly more bad. Did anyone write down the results of this?
Yes, well,
okay.
We have gone much more optimistic, can I say?
Okay, Paul, you feedback. What's your
so the somewhat optimistic has pretty much stayed the same, but what has increased is the very optimistic.
Excellent.
So thank you very much all for letting us know. In fact, the somewhat optimistic is now increasing even more, almost to 60%, yes.
So we have a webinar.
So, yeah, 60%.
A daily webinar?
A daily webinar. Make us all much more positive.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. So let me go around the panel and just maybe maybe start in the room here. Is there one thing in the future, if there was one thing you could do that would make a difference that you might think might get us to get a drug to market more quickly for yourself or recommendation for anybody else, what would that one thing be?
Getting more people involved. The more people involved, because one person's dementia is different to another person's dementia.
Yeah.
If you've got 1 million people with dementia in this country, you need to read 1 million textbooks to begin to understand the dementia. So the more people you have involved in a study, the better your results will be.
Yeah.
Because you get a better understanding of how that drug works on a wider range of dementias.
So participation, engagement, involvement. Martin, what would be the one thing you do? And by the way, don't commit to your whole company to this, by the way. But from your personal perspective, what's the one thing?
Yeah, I meant the sense of urgency. So we need to press on. But I think what we can do even more of is work together and come together as a community. Yeah, share the data, share the experiences, and ensure we have more rapid cycles. Yeah, and we get faster in coming to eventually find new disease-modifying treatments. Collaboration,
I love that. Philipp.
Yeah, to expand on that, I think the importance is what Martin said about being rapid, being fast, learning from trials we have run, and that for me means that acceleration is heavily based on predictive screening and progression biomarkers, which would help us again take decisions earlier without having to run 5-year-long phase 3 trials and be able to take decisions in earlier, smaller studies.
Eliezer?
I totally agree that with the issue of biomarkers, participation, and data sharing. So to add another element is a greater and deeper understanding of the basic mechanisms of disease. I think for many years we have been focused on a single mechanism that involves amyloid beta protein, but I think if I could go back in time and accelerate on something, would be to look at other mechanisms and go into even greater detail.
And Pippa, the one thing you're going to do to help us all find a cure for Alzheimer's?
Well, obviously, I'm going to set up a school for journalism and dementia.
I faked you into your answer. Very good. Okay.
But I think, on a serious note, though, I think there is something about educating the journalists, because we're not all Tom Whipple. We didn't all read maths at Cambridge, which is what he did. You know, we don't all have these double brains. So I think it's true.
So we've got 3 minutes left. I want 30 seconds just to summarize some of the things I picked up as the key themes of what I thought has been a brilliant, absolutely brilliant webinar. We talked about responsibility in terms of our communication. We talked about the balance between the science and the optimism. We talked at the end there from Howard about the engagement that's absolutely critical. And it was lovely to hear from Philipp and Martin about how we work together to accelerate, to speed up these discoveries and these mechanisms, which we talked about. And the one thing that came out for me, and it comes out of all of these webinars, is research equals hope. And I think I'd like to end on that point and pass to Paola for some final words.
Thank you so much, and you summarized the panel so well. I've got 2 points I'd like to make on this panel before we say goodbye to you. The first one, I want to pick up on something that Eliezer said earlier. America has a plan, and they're looking at trying to do something by 2025. This has put a sense of urgency in the country. As we always say at ADI, you have to start with a plan. So if you're sitting in your office, in your home, and wondering, what can you do? Well, you can help us all, because you can go and try and with your local association create the movement of people that will bring your government to do a plan. And indeed, we are launching next week, no, in 2 weeks' time, sorry, in Geneva, our latest From Plan to Action report that will examine, the Global Dementia Observatory will examine what actually is happening in countries, and will also look at the positive examples like America that have really gone for it and they're trying to make a difference. So please, if you have a chance, read that report. And finally, the other way that everybody can participate is please take our surveys on global attitudes to dementia. You will have seen it. Everybody coming on this call will receive a link. Please don't just take the survey yourself. Ask everybody you know to take it. We have had thousands of answers so far, but we want more. And we actually, at the moment, need more men. So can I say to the men on this panel as well, this is also your job. Please take the survey, Craig has done it, and tell your mates to do it. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking part and for making this webinar so interesting. The team will get back to everybody who had a question and did not receive an answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.